Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by...
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We are all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
Hi, welcome to season 5. We are really excited to start the season with everybody and very excited to tell you that the movie we're going to start our season 5 with is Into the Spider-Verse, one of my favorite movies. And just going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about in the episode today. We're going to talk a little bit about confidence, grief and loss, and we'll also be a little bit about group therapy. And then, of course, final thoughts like usual. And just to give you an idea of what Into the Spider-Verse is about, we're kind of experiencing the universe with Miles Morales, who is becoming Spider-Man in front of us. And as we're viewing that, the impact that has on his relationships, his family, but also a huge twist is all of the other different portrayals,
multiverses versions.
Yeah, all the multiverse versions of this character end up coming into the story. And so it's a really different, probably not for people who read the comic books, but in terms of the movie versions of Spider-Man we've gotten, this is a very different portrayal of that experience. And so we kind of follow them trying to, as always, save the world from something super terrible. But one of the really amazing things also about this movie is that it has the main character is a young man of color, and we see the way that the way that it impacts his family. It's just really kind of magical watching a film where the most important people are all people of color. Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited to get started talking about this today. And yeah, so did we just the first topic that we had said was confidence. And I guess what do you guys want to say first?
Well, I think we kind of follow two sort of like main characters in this movie. It's Miles Morales, who is becoming Spider-Man. And then we also follow Peter B. Parker, who is a multiverse Spider-Man, who's kind of at the more of the other end of the journey of like having been Spider-Man for, I think, like 20 plus years. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what's interesting to watch this movie is how confidence seems to be like the guiding kind of link between both characters in very different ways, and that Miles is trying to find confidence for the first time, sort of. And Peter B. Parker has lost his confidence and trying to figure out who he is again after having been, an idol, a quote unquote, like hero for so many years. I guess I also want to kind of say that spoiler now for Spider-Man Far From Home, the newest Spider-Man, as in, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, spoilers. In that there is a lot of crossover plot-wise between this movie and Spider-Man Far From Home. So there's a good chance we're going to be talking about it. So if you don't want to be spoiled about Spider-Man Far From Home, you might want to pause on this episode before you listen. Because I know that movie it's not new, but it's also not like the oldest Marvel movie that's come out, I'm just trying to be considerate.
It made the most money. It made the most money a movie has ever made.
That's true.
I feel like most people saw it, but understandable.
So I think with Miles, we introduced to him kind of coming against a lot of, a really hard time and a lot of factors that interact with being confident, right? Like how old is he? Like 14? Do we know?
Probably 15, 16.
I feel like he was like a freshman. I guess I always assumed he was like a freshman in high school because he's going to this like new school or newer school to him, out on a scholarship. Like my always assumption is that he's kind of on the younger end of high school.
I think
Are you guys both Googling this right now?
We can, we can Google this. But yeah, I think when we watch Miles's growth arc, there's a lot of things that he has to accept about his identity in order to develop confidence throughout this film. And part of it is becoming comfortable with the fact that he's smarter than most of the kids in his neighborhood. And he's different from the kids that he goes to school with. Being gifted is a challenge for a lot of kids' identity when you realize that you're going to step into a totally different world than has ever been available to many of the kids that you knew your whole life.
I don't know if I would want to say that he's gifted above everyone else. I think there's an access piece there as well, that not everyone probably got the chance or the support around taking one of those exams, but I could be wrong because I know it's different in the city. And so it could be different where do you know what I mean?
I think we can touch upon
there's always caveats, but perspective, he has to differentiate between himself and the other kids who aren't going. He's leaving one school. We see him walking past his old school, going to this residential private school, which is obviously to parents or a police officer and a nurse.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what you're hitting upon, which is, kind of all these factors I was alluding to, is that he is having to come into some of his natural gifts, just as even without the superhero component, like you're saying, Hannah Googled it. He was 14. My assumption is that this is his first year at this school. And so maybe he tested into this fancy high school. And you're right in that they do show in the beginning of the movie that he's kind of walking through his neighborhood and kind of trying to have these little moments of connection with his neighborhood peers, and them kind of teasing him a little bit, about the fact that he's college boy, that kind of energy of you think you're a college boy, not in a mean spirited way. It seems like a very lovely neighborhood that he's in, but definitely feeling that disconnection of having to fit in a place where you didn't grow up there. You maybe look different than the other kids. You have different socioeconomic status than the other kids, possibly. They make it known that he's a scholarship student, right away, which that has, social connotations to it. And that can be really stigmatizing because in those kind of settings, kids typically know who the scholarship kids are. And can be a lot of kind of old school status, classist energies in those schools. Where we live in Chicago, none of us have high school aged kids, but as a child therapist who works with kids and teenagers in Chicago, there is that flavor here as well of you have to test into high school the way you test into college. There's a lot of pressure and a lot of classism in some of these schools in terms of where you get in and how well you do and what that means. It's it's like a catch-22 thing where I'm glad that kids who are very smart have spaces to really maybe maximize their potential. And it's also at what cost in terms of all these other factors. So he's entering a setting and you can tell that he doesn't necessarily want to be there. One of the things they show right away is that he's trying to intentionally fail out of this pretty prestigious school.
Right, because he gets all the questions. He gets a 0% on the test, which we see the teacher calling him on and go the only way to get a 0 on a standardized multi-question test is to know what the right answer is.
And to intentionally, give the wrong one, which actually I thought was pretty cool of the teacher to not just write him off, but to say I'm reading between the lines of your behavior and I'm not going to let you fail. That was actually pretty cool.
Well, and I feel Ben, it's a part of what you were saying until I interrupted you, that he is having to connect with that part of him, with that part, that he has things that other people don't have in terms of being gifted.
Yeah, he's gifted in science and technology, just like Peter is. And for him to have to recognize that, from the kids that he has been going to school with, that might be a lot of differentiation between playing sports and hanging out with those kids and doing typical junior high level academics versus what he's going to be doing at this particular school.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what he does have on his side too, Miles, is he has really supportive parents, like you were saying, Hannah, who, seems like they probably went out of their way to like see if he had scholarship opportunities, to really push him and to really like make that a priority for Miles in a way that other families might not have the privilege to do. And yeah, I think a big part of Miles, the whole kind of his trajectory is sort of recognizing that he's special and kind of owning that he's special and allowing himself to be special, and not just like reluctant hero, but kind of like, I do have something within me. And I think also, like I said, that one of the big factors, part of the being 14 is so much of that is a time in your life when you just are, I mean, some people might not have been, but I think you are just developmentally self-conscious. And even when he is sort of like evolving as Spider-Man, he keeps saying like, it's just puberty, which I thought was actually very funny. But I think it does speak to also that time in our life when so much is going on with our bodies and our personalities, even, that we don't quite understand. And so we just assume it's like growing up, or assume it's like puberty. And we don't really get, because it's so embarrassing, I guess, for lack of a better word, or it can feel so embarrassing, we don't get support around it.
Right. And seeing Miles go through that in a different way than Peter does. Mm-hmm. And Peter came from a family of scientists. Granted, he lost his parents early and was raised by his aunt and uncle, but the expectations on Peter to be smart and to be this science whiz kid was always there. And for Miles in this version, it seems like Miles has tested out and clearly demonstrated his academic capabilities are higher than some of the other kids that he's around. And his parents do go out of their way to get him an opportunity outside of the neighborhood school. Mm-hmm. Whereas Peter seems to have had access to better schools throughout his development than what we see Miles being going like, okay, you're just so much smarter than what this school can offer you. And we got to get you to a place that matches what you can be, because his family over and over tells him that he represents the best in them. Mm-hmm. He obviously has like a massive support from everyone. Mm-hmm. To grow, you have to go and become what you're meant to be, because you're the best of all of us. You're smarter than the rest of us. And not that his parents aren't smart or his parents aren't capable and hardworking folks, but like that they all recognize, and his uncle too recognize that, like, Miles, your academic abilities need more teaching than can be offered here. Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it's one of those situations where we really see, well, part of what I feel like I really noticed is really seeing how much support he gets from everybody. Like, it's a very much like a whole line that his family draws of, we all support you. We all know that you can do whatever you want, and we're here to help you get through that in any way that we can. And I think one of the things, and again, and especially in terms of having this version, Miles, of Spider-Man, my cat is interrupting, that by having that,
Just your thought. First time season 5, everybody. Take it.
Oh, and also everybody, for the season, I'm going to make an actual bingo and we'll be posting it. And so look forward to something bingo related coming up in the season.
Hannah says the F word and her cat interrupts her and her thought train.
Yeah.
You got 3 in a row right there.
It's like you win the whole thing. Anyway, so what I was saying is that he has parents for the first time, and we actually get to see him interact, and how kind of magical it is to not only have him be represented in terms of being a young man of color, also having parents who are there, who are supportive, who are kind, who also seem like the kind of parents that are very much on the same page with each other. Like, their relationship, even though we don't get to see their parents a lot, we kind of are able to see that they all support him in the same way. And And yeah, they seem loving and caring. They seem loving of each other. And there's just a lot of different ways that I feel like we get to see that. And that's just so different from what we normally see. But I think that's a part of what helps him. I think that's what is a part of helping him try to figure that piece out for himself. And I think it's really helpful to have that consistent support across his family. It might feel a little intense because he might feel pressure, but I think there's also this really consistent positive support that he has, really helping him get to a place to accept some of these kind of amazing things about himself.
Yeah, I will say, jumping in as someone who got their specialty in, working with gifted kids, is I think what I do see that I might only feel sensitive about because of that is that there is this, which resolves itself at the end of the movie, is that there also is though this sort of very pinpoint focus on his academics. Like he wants to do this art. His dad's like, your art is whatever, really want to focus on his schoolwork. They are, choosing his schoolwork over him being within his community. And, they're putting him in a position where he doesn't have any friends at his new school. Like he has to live there. Like they're really taking him out of their community space. I do like that he does get to go home on the weekends because that gives him a chance to still be with his friends and kick it on the weekends with his neighborhood friends and be with his parents. And I do like by the end of the movie, his dad does kind of acknowledge hey, your art is important too. And I'm sorry that I got so caught up in your academic ability. And I think that is what can really happen with quote unquote really smart kids, is that there can be a lot, or even kids who are the first in their family to do exceptionally well. The first kids to go to college. You see this a lot when I've worked with people who are coming first generation immigrant families, that kind of thing of there's a lot of pressure on you to excel and you have to, it's almost perfectionistic tendencies occur, which I could see also with becoming Spider-Man could really converge on itself. So it's nice to see by the end of this movie, there's a lot of resolution around him being a whole person and not just Spider-Man or not just a really smart kid. There's a lot of embracing of him totally in the, his whole sense of himself, which I think is what also gives him confidence, because as we kind of see in juxtaposition to Peter B. Parker, is that if you only have a sense of value from one part of your life, like being a superhero, being really smart, whatever, and you don't diversify your value, that will eat itself eventually, because then if something occurs within the one place that you get value, it can really dive bomb your sense of identity, your sense of confidence. It really is important. And I talk about this a lot in therapy I do with people. You have to diversify your value to yourself, your value to others. You can't just be, I only have value if I'm getting straight A's. I only have value if I'm, effectively Spider-Man. You really have to have all different parts of yourself. So I think a really lovely message of this movie is, I want to give you space to make art. And I acknowledge that you had this relationship with your uncle, and really letting Miles be all these different parts of himself and not just this one version, which I think when you have a child that has really great potential, I think it can be really hard not to unconsciously kind of pigeonhole them, because you want them to do so well. And because they are so smart, you know what I mean? He is really smart. And I think it's finding that line as a parent of really wanting to encourage their potential without feeding into perfectionistic tendencies that can really, really, when I see adults who were, gifted as kids. I was also in the gifted program as a kid. You can probably dial a lot back to that. And so it is, so I also have a little skin in the game personally about how we interact with kids who are quote unquote special in a very specific way.
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at, as we start this story and then move through it, we see Miles have to, right in the intro of the story, we see Miles go through being very comfortable, being a part of both of his cultures. We see him very connected to speaking Spanish and talking to people in changing in and out of language as he moves through. Too. Right. Well, code switching, but also language switching to depend on. And recognizing that his mother, Rio Morales, in the story of Miles, is a community organizer in addition to being a nurse. So both his parents are really involved in the community, and at least in the video game version of Spider-Man and then the Miles Morales offshoot, he loses his dad in an attack, and they have to adjust to that. But we see like both of these people are large community figures, and him being really attached to his neighborhood is an important part of who he is. And we're seeing him, I'm assuming he's leaving Brooklyn and going to Manhattan for school.
It's definitely far enough where, well, I guess he could technically walk there.
But he had to ride the train. He had to ride the train. His dad took him.
Okay.
Yeah. He had to ride the train. I'm assuming he was going from Brooklyn to Manhattan. That's
Probably.
The feel.
That would make sense. Yeah.
But looking at like the way he's so integrated into that community, plus having parents that are community fixtures and being able to be so comfortable among his people, and then be shifting to this whole new school, this whole new identity, like where he is not known. He is one of a new incoming class of freshmen, new kids that just moved into this residential place.
He hasn't even met his roommate yet.
Nope.
In this movie. Yeah.
So we like watch him kind of have to go through that, along with the discomfort of realizing that you just got bitten by a radioactive spider from another dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And we see him like being really uncomfortable with it. That's part of why he goes and seeks out Uncle Aaron a couple of times, is because he's feeling a loss of connection to who he is when he's wearing, like he's going to school. He's got his like retro, like Jordan 1s on, and he's like jamming to his music and like really comfortable with who he is. But then as soon as he's in school, he's in these uniforms and part of this different class of society, and then working on all of that, plus puberty, plus trying to reckon with, am I actually Spider-Man?
Mm-hmm.
Who I just watched die?
Well, and also that too of like, you can see him in this movie, which is very age appropriate, leaning a lot on a mentor, like his Uncle Aaron, then the OG Spider-Man of that world, and then who promises he's going to, because that comes up several times. Like he's always like, are you going to teach me? Because the other Peter Parker said he was going to teach me. Like he repeats that repeatedly, I was supposed to be taught and now I'm not going to be taught. Are you going to teach me? Like with the panic that I definitely resonate with, is with the like anxiety. Like he's like, someone please like tell me like what to do.
Yeah. Well, and also somebody who has the experience of asking for what they need and asking for what they need and getting it. And knowing that if I don't get it, I'm just going to ask in a different way, or I'm going to keep asking so I can understand why I'm not allowed to have this thing that I was offered.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he is very confident in a lot of ways. Like the fact that he keeps speaking up about, like you're saying, Hannah, like getting his needs met, the fact that he even thinks he can. I mean, I think part of it is a sense of obligation, which probably comes out of being part of a community, like you were saying, Ben, like being raised by people who are very integrated, like very have a lot of accountability within their community, like support.
They're integral community figures.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that I didn't know that because I don't read the comic books or anything. And so it would make sense with this character why when he takes on the fact of like, I have to get the goober and like to like put the goober in the thing, that he feels that he takes that on so readily, but also kind of feels the weight of that responsibility with no guidance and like really looking for that. And I think it is hard. And I think like him being so connected to his Uncle Aaron, I think also is him looking for that continued like diversity of values, and that Aaron does like, encourages art, and, it lets him kind of be not bad, but like sort of like, break the rules a little bit, which I think is always fun when you're that age.
Or the child of a police officer who is very strict and on top of the rules.
Yeah. Like texting you, have you done your homework, when you don't even live at home?
Right. So like seeing his dad obviously has really high expectations, and Uncle Aaron allows him to kind of he presents more neutrally, even though, Aaron has his own complicated history, but we see Aaron having a really positive impact on him because he just lets him be who he is. Mm-hmm. and gives him space and encourages him. And we'd see his mom do that, but in a overly smothery kind of way. And dad does it. He shows love by being on top of him and in his business and pushing him more so than encouraging him.
Yeah. And he feels that pressure. Like a quote that I wrote down when I was watching it is Miles says, like, I'm tired of letting everybody down. Like he is feeling the weight of being held as responsible and being kind of like toted as special, but feeling more of the, which makes a lot of sense when you're 14, feeling more of the downside of maybe being unique or special than necessarily feeling the coolness or the power of that. Like the true confidence of it is feeling more of the responsibility in a way that he's 14, he's such a young, like he's so young in terms of like the superheroes we see in these movies. Like he's so young.
Peter's usually young. Spider-Man's usually young, but Miles starts a little bit earlier than I think we usually see it start about 15, 16.
Okay. I'm just used to all these old ass men playing him in the movies like Tobey Maguire.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, the advantage of having a cartoon is a cartoon can actually, act like a 14-year-old or look like one with an adult voicing them instead of, being a grown man with a personal trainer and a diet plan.
Yeah.
Actually, we watched the version that has additional information, and it was really interesting. The person who voiced Miles was actually, it was definitely older, and they definitely,
25.
It was 25. Yeah. But it was really interesting to see how they came to kind of feeling the character and the way that they did. And so it's just really interesting and kind of in general. And I feel like another part of confidence, or another thing that I feel like we see with him, is that when he finally gets to the point where I feel like, besides the fact that he's had so much trauma so quickly, which is a part of kind of what we see in superhero movies. And I feel like a part of the impetus for him to really accept that he is Spider-Man and figure out how to use the gifts that he has is when he's webbed up and he can't let his father in so that he can so he can get a hug from his dad. Like, I think that in that moment when he was webbed up in the chair, I think he would have opened the door and run into his dad's arms. Like, I think, and knowing that he couldn't do that and feeling like there was something in him that he definitely could have gotten out of that because he is in fact Spider-Man, I think was I think it makes a lot of sense that the reason why he had to accept himself is because for the love of his family and the love of his parents and his dad, and not being able to connect with him because he can't figure out how to use his new gifts that he just got.
Right. And so much of Miles is like recognizing that in order to be Miles and be the Spider-Man that Miles is, it's not about trying to be dad or trying to be Uncle Aaron or trying to be Peter.
Yes.
It's about being Miles.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so beautiful about this story is that when Miles accepts that he can be Miles, that he doesn't have to be the red and blue classic Spider-Man, but that he can be this integrated, multicultural, or complicated identity person who is, in addition to being a STEM student, is also an artist and needs to have that freedom of expression in order to be himself. We see him actualize when he accepts, I am many things. And in order to be the version of me and have the unique spider powers and access to them, I have to stop trying to control everything and trying to be the version of me that I think others think I'm supposed to be, and be me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wonder if what really helps that is that the Peter Parker of his world, the one that dies in the beginning of the movie, does have this sort of like perfect persona. He's like just perfectionistic kind of coming out of his ears is kind of the energy with this Peter. And I wonder if what really helps Miles is actually kind of incidentally being mentored by a Peter that's kind of a mess, and maybe even kind of like took some of the shine off of like being perfect, kind of seeing this like Spider-Man who doesn't really have it all together, and that there isn't really a version like that by him also being Spider-Man, he doesn't have it all together, you know, and then also like he's not supposed to be like Peter, like this idealized version. And that, you know, probably looking at Peter and being like, well, I don't really want to be like you. Like I kind of would rather be like my version of myself, because I wonder if he had been mentored by the original Peter, if there would have been still a bit more of the perpetuation of this like perfectionistic ideal. Because Peter has it all together, and this Peter still has like probably a girlfriend, and he's killing it at grad school, and he's like cocky and like, you know, killing it out there. And he's
married. This one's in his 30s.
I mean, like OG Peter.
Yeah, the OG
like
Mary Jane. Yeah, it's his wife. She introduced herself as his. Okay. That Peter was my husband. So I guess.
Oh, that makes sense, because when he dies, they do say over the announcement, 26-year-old Peter Parker, who's a grad student. So I know he was still kind of on the young side, like this Peter, OG Peter.
Yeah. Like he's established and integrated in the community. And you're right. Like the example he said in some Miles stories, that's the version of, we see Peter interacting with Miles and mentoring him. And in this version of this story, I think it is a really interesting dynamic that we see a Peter that didn't do things right all the time, that has demons, that has to reckon with himself and has to work on, you know what, I made some mistakes. And I think when we start looking at how that Peter presents himself immediately, and digesting that also has to be part of Miles' journey, is that Miles has to reckon with things aren't always the way they were, and people's journeys don't end where you think they did. And they often are more complicated. And we see that with his relationship with his uncle, and realizing his uncle's the Prowler in addition to being the good uncle, and that the other version of Peter still went through being Spider-Man, but then lost it all.
Mm-hmm. It really dispels this idea that there's a perfect way to be, which I think when you're that age as well, I think a lot of just 14-year-olds, teenagers fall into that idea. It's part of that rigidity, that sort of all or nothing thinking that we just have at that age, of like, there's a correct way to be, and I just need to figure out what that is. And if I can just get a sense of that, if I can just find the right person to basically copy paste on, then I will have a life, like a perfect life, or at least a life that I want. It's so much of that identity seeking that we do at that age. And I do really like that Miles did end up getting a mentor who's kind of like, I keep saying kind of a mess, but really he's very vulnerable, I guess is how I'd put it. You know, he really, though he's not really maybe the most, he doesn't go about like communicating kind of his vulnerability in like the best way, the most like mature way. I think, I don't know, I kind of feel like it might have been a gift for Miles to see someone who, you know, is kind of a mess. I mean, we can transition to talking about this Peter B. Parker, kind of the Nick Miller version of Spider-Man. And kind of he's on the other end of it, where he, I'm assuming, was very confident and cocky. That's kind of how he portrays it. And then over the course of like, I guess the real life experience of being a superhero, really loses it all, because what we really see with him is sort of the chronic trauma of being a superhero for a long time. And not in like a splashy kind of like way we see with other superheroes, where it's like, I'm just dark and I live in a cave by myself and a bunch of bats. Yeah, I did it first, Ben. I brought up Batman first. This is honestly, I think what I like about this portrayal of like the chronic superhero trauma is that it really is kind of more in like the sad, not sexy ways that trauma can present, of like, not that trauma is sexy, but not in the stylized way. Like he's like crying in the shower. He's eating a lot of pizza. He gets divorced. He has like a very sad divorced apartment, you know, kind of that stereotypical, like if anyone watches Big Mouth, that song they have about like basically the apartment building that all the divorced dads live in. It's like that energy.
Well, and I really feel like it's so what I was going to say is, one of the things that I really like about having Peter B. Parker be in this story, and what I feel like he really brings, is some genuine human responses to experiencing different kinds of real life adversity in terms of your relationships. And which is something we always see in superhero movies. We always see the struggle to have a manageable life or a manageable relationships because you're so busy putting the world in front of everything else because that's the responsibility that you feel like you have to. And so one of the things that I really loved about this Peter Parker is that he, even though it seems like he has been experiencing depressive symptoms and having depressive symptoms over grief and loss, which we talk about all the time, that I feel like pretty quickly is able to, he does push back a little bit in the beginning pretty hard with Miles, but that he really pretty quickly is able to recognize that he could help this young person, that he could maybe help Miles, and is willing to do that. And I feel like is also like confused and surprised by how it makes him feel when he is able to help and support this new Spider-Man, especially because his experience, Peter B. Parker's experience, would have been the same as everyone else's that ends up coming into the movie, which is I have to do this alone. Nobody knows. And you have to figure everything out by yourself.
Well, the core trauma of like the Spider-Man story, no matter which version we see, like even like Gwen Stacy's and like Penny Parker and all that stuff, is this trauma very early on of that if I let someone into my world as the superhero, it will kill them. And so this defining trauma that breeds possible isolation, in the way that I think specifically Gwen talks about it in the movie, but just kind of the isolation that comes along with being a solitary superhero, which was what we see with Peter Parker, a lot of time by himself. He gets divorced, he loses Aunt May. So also the things that he kind of had that kept him in the world outside of being a superhero, he also loses, which feeds into, you mentioned it, Hannah, like at the onset of his presentation in this movie, he does seem more depressed. And by that, we mean like tearful, kind of like feelings of worthlessness, social isolation. His appetite seems a little all over the place. I'm sure his sleep patterns all over the place. Like he probably could walk into a therapist's office and get diagnosed with some sort of mood, like maybe depression, but they might want to see him a little bit longer before they gave him that diagnosis. But he is demonstrating a lot of behaviors based on his self-report but what we see that is more aligned with someone who's pretty depressed and sad, and who is, but like we said, also influenced by his trauma. Like, I think something that really stood out for me is, and you guys can tell me what you think, is the reason why he and MJ get divorced is because she wants to have kids and he doesn't. And he does say, she wanted kids and I was scared. He doesn't say I didn't want to have kids. He said I was scared. And I don't know how that couldn't be attached to kind of the trauma of his life.
It has to be like the core ethos of Peter Parker is with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah. And
part of it is that people close to me can get hurt. But the other core part of any iteration of Peter is personal inaction and failure to exercise the power that you have causes loss that you're directly responsible for. Mm-hmm. And that's what separates Peter a little bit differently than some of the other, or not Peter, but any Spider-Man or Spider-Woman, any Spider character. I mean, I don't know what Spider-Ham lost, but he, mm-hmm. like looking at the core ethos of this character is that having power and not using it causes the loss more so than like just letting people in, and then later letting people into your identity causes the betrayal and the hurt. Mm-hmm. So it's both layers. So when we see Peter B go through this, remembering that he likely lost his Uncle Ben, very similar to the mm-hmm. traditional Peter Parker storyline, which is that he gets his powers and doesn't stop a robber that he could have stopped, who ends up killing Uncle Ben. Mm-hmm. So to see him afraid to add children into that would also factor into his likely fear that I will do something wrong and they will get hurt. I will fail to do something. And we see this version of Peter really avoidant, which is a trauma symptom. We see him really detached and unplugged and pulling away from things. And we see him even pull away from MJ, which would make sense after a life of chronic loss, that he would be like, nope, this is scary. And adding a child that I am dependent for. MJ is always a firecracker, can take care of herself. Mm-hmm. A child is not going to be that.
I mean, it's very reminiscent. What you just described is very reminiscent of who, Hannah?
Luke Skywalker, which I wrote down in my notes, that it's very much the Last Jedi version of Spider-Man, where he doesn't want to train anybody else because he doesn't want to lose anyone, or he doesn't want to make the wrong decision with anybody else. And so instead he decides that he's not going to do anything. And I would definitely say that clearly our Peter B. Parker comes to that conclusion much quicker. And I think a part of what I feel like another part, because they are together for a little bit before everybody comes into the story. But I do feel like also once they start seeing all of the other versions, I do feel like our Peter B. Parker starts to almost define a new role for himself. And in terms of like being a leader of these group of people who are all like him in one way or another, which is just kind of magical. And the idea of that is pretty wild, just kind of in general, when we think about existing with identities, with other identities of ourself that are not ourself at the same time.
Well, I think it kind of goes into this idea of kind of when I was talking about Miles and like diversifying your value, I think it's also kind of similar with Peter B, in that he is transitioning from like a student mastery position, like a young buck, like hero position, to the confidence, to the identity and the value of being a teacher, and like the empowerment we can get from mentoring and from shifting from like the player to the coach kind of thing. And how good it feels to support someone who maybe was in your position. And also, like, not to get too deep with it, but also I think you can connect it to, it's on the bingo card. I think you can also connect it to when I talk about inner child work with adults I work with, is I think sometimes when we are in mentorship positions, especially in something as uniquely specific as this when we watch this movie, where he is in a lot of ways looking at his younger self and really being able to take care of a younger version of yourself the way that you need to be taken care of at that age, can be really powerful for you, and can do like inner child healing, and can help us. Because one thing he is not nice to himself. Peter B. Parker thinks he's hot trash, and he has a little bit of a bravado, but he definitely, you can tell, thinks he's hot trash. And so I think too, when we are kind to a younger version of ourselves or someone kind of in a similar position, it also kind of almost forces us to be kinder to ourselves.
Right. Because Peter B's identity is singularly wrapped up, not in being Spider-Man. He obviously takes that very much for granted. His identity was wrapped up in being with MJ's
husband.
And when he lost that, he retreated away from having value and just kind of did Spider-Man things. And we can see that kind of attitude on him, that it's not that diversified sense of self.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also very much a part of experiencing a lot of trauma and feeling and being connected to those other identities that we have, when really the one that actually holds a lot of meaning for us is being a husband. But that because of the way that he's been focused on all his different values, that isn't something that he feels like he can give a lot of time and energy to, even though that's the one that holds the most meaning. So it's also kind of having this experience of having, and also the complicated values of being a superhero also are pretty intense regardless. But when we think about it in terms of in terms of grief and loss, like we talk about so often, losing your identity in some way, or losing the identity that made you feel the most connected to something, or losing something that you thought you would always have, and the change that and the impact that has on how we feel about ourselves, and how we feel about ourselves in terms of who are we and who can we continue to be. And I think a part of what is really beautiful in this film, besides everything, is the experience of literally having a group of people who have experienced some version of the exact thing that you have experienced. And the only other place that we have something like that is in group therapy.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only thing I could.
Before we jump into that, we
have to talk about something else.
We'll take an ad break. So, and we're back. Yeah. So jumping into the idea of the universality that is group therapy. So I can throw it back to you, Hannah.
And so a part of the reason why group therapy works, and why even though it can be intense, it can be hard. Part of the reason why it works is because sitting in a room connecting with other people who have experienced the same thing is such a powerful experience in terms of a big part of what trauma does to our narrative about ourselves and about the world is it has this huge impact on the idea of being alone, the idea of being, I'm the only one who's experienced this. Nobody else has had to have this experience. And therefore there's something wrong with me. That must mean that I'm inherently bad. I'm inherently unlovable, all these other pieces. And which is why experiencing other people in a room all together who are connected to similar traumas or similar experience, or even just similar emotions in terms of, I feel tearful a lot of the time, or I feel confused or frustrated a lot of the time. Even having 6 or 5 other people be like, yeah, it feels like that for me too. When I can't do my dishes, I feel the same way, and somebody else says something else. And a part of that healing is group validation. It's having the support of other people and to help you reinforce the positive or neutral narrative. You are not alone. Mm-hmm. You are not alone. And that feeling, PTSD, depressive symptoms, anxiety, really tries to make us believe that we are alone in these experiences, which is part of why group therapy is so effective. And I think something that we see in this film is watching all of them kind of stand around each other and putting their arms around each other like, no, actually, we are the only people who could actually understand this. And we can tell you right now that we have all experienced something like this. And being able to, again, just like Brittany, just like you said, being able to be the support that you needed for yourself when you were a younger version of yourself. Mm-hmm. And how also we see this in No Way Home. Mm-hmm. In No Way Home, we see Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. I'm just using those names because it's easiest for me. Those two versions being able to step in with Tom Holland's Peter Parker and stop him from making the mistake that they both felt like they made. And having somebody to be like, hey, this could be the result of that, or let me help you get that rage out so that you don't have to experience the consequences of having these feelings because of your loss that you just experienced, that just happened in front of you a couple of days ago. And you see how healing that is for Tom Holland's character. And we also see how I feel like that plays such a big part and why we see Miles be able to self-actualize so kind of quickly. Once he decides, it happens pretty fast. I mean, yes, it's a movie, blah, 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 but like it happens pretty fast. And I think a part of that is when you have 6 people looking back at you and saying, you can do this. We have all been here. It's something that you have to figure out for yourself, but also you're not alone in this experience. And that's a part of why group therapy can be especially in terms of being trauma survivors of one kind or another, why it can be so powerful. And why it can really I really can open a narrative that has been very closed for a really long time for people who've experienced trauma.
Well,
I think that's a fantastic analysis of that, and the power of that, particularly for inclusive groups like trauma survivors, like veterans, like police officers, any other first responder, sexual violence survivors, being around other people that have an ability to see the darkness in the world in the same way that you do is really, really important sometimes, that they don't have to explain. Because one of the most important things to know about trauma group therapy is that what is not helpful is to sit around and share the war stories and be mired in the details, because what happens is then you trigger people's consciousness to leave the present and they dissociate. And the thing that's really important to understand about trauma is that your consciousness or your body responds to where your consciousness is dissociated to. So if people who are sitting around in a group all dissociating into their trauma, their body all goes into threat response mode, trying to take the knowledge of the present that knows everything that happened and apply that to what happened in the past, as if they can go back and use that information to change the past. And that is critical to have a competent therapist to prevent that from happening, to keep it about what's your experience been, how has it been, how did you get through it, how have things affected you, but not getting into the nitty gritty, mired details of what happened.
Yes, and that's such a good point, Ben. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I feel like a part of sometimes, especially because I, in the last year, have experienced group therapy, and that part of what I feel like people don't quite understand about the starting group therapy is the rules. And why are there rules? And why do I have to do this a certain way? And I think what clinicians would explain is this is for protection of everyone in this room. We have these rules and these examples of, like, we had to use target behaviors versus like substance use or something else. So we had to use the word target behaviors. Sometimes there's the way that we don't ever go into a lot of detail about the trauma, because we know that re-traumatization is so common in terms of, and that we don't have to experience re-traumatization in order to heal. That is not a part of how we manage our healing. And so just kind of as a general thing for people who don't know anything about group therapy, is that it is very common to have rules. And I know that my first response, even though I'm a fucking therapist, and I know that having rules is a part of that, I was frustrated because one of the rules was no cursing, which we all know how that goes with me. But that at the same time, when I really think about, if we experience, all the different traumas that we experience, like cursing might be something that happened on a regular basis to you. So it would make sense. Yeah, it could be aggressive. It could be aggressive language. So, but again, that is a part of why group therapy has to have structure, and it has to have rules, and it has to have a really good clinician who is confident in their ability to redirect, shift or change, and really help and empower everyone to know this is your space and we want the space to be safe for you. And in order to do that, these are the rules that we're following so that we can continue to have experiences that feel inclusive and that feel validating.
And as part of all of that is recognizing that, I know I said it like about recognizing going into threat mode, but what heals trauma is being able to keep your body calm and realize that you can re-regulate yourself and that you don't have to stay trapped in that threat response mode again. And that's why it's really important that you don't allow in the group setting for people to get into those stories and what happened in those moments, because then everybody gets re-traumatized, everybody gets re-triggered, nobody feels safe. People withdraw from the process into dissociation, into protective behaviors, into target behaviors, and nobody gets any healing. But recognizing the difference between that and individual therapies. In individual sessions, you want to go into exactly that, to pair what happened in the past So the distressing memories to be paired with the relaxed muscle body. Whereas in group therapy, you want people to feel like they're not alone and they can get in control of their response so that they can work through the hard things they need to do one-on-one. And
Absolutely.
Brittany, I'm sorry, I jumped you. Go ahead.
It's okay. So I was just kind of bringing it back to how this aligns with this movie specifically, is that we don't really see what we've been talking about, that context of like group therapy, if you want to think of it like that. What we kind of see more in this movie, which is what you guys have talked about, is more because the situation at hand in both the most recent Spider-Man movie and Into the Spider-Verse is that there's this unique situation in which many people show up that have a very, very specifically aligned experience with the protagonist. And so I think what's hard with Ben, you brought this up, it made me think of vets specifically, is that when a vet kind of leaves active service and kind of goes back home, quote unquote, or goes back into, I guess, civilian life, is that part of what's so hard is that unless they know people in their life that have also gone through it, they can feel really isolated. And so then it isn't so much that I think there's something wrong with me as much as there's no one else who gets it. And so I think what is powerful about the group dynamic we see in both of these Spider-Man movies is that there is the unique experience to be in direct communication with people who almost know exactly what it's like to have your lived experience, a shared lived experience. And I think this is almost more of, there's a difference between groups that are run by therapists and groups that are run more like support groups, or like more like, I think when you watch movies and you see like vet groups, like that's usually run, or even like recovery groups can be run a lot by a quote unquote like layperson who is on who's at a more progressed place.
So I would
leading the group as more of a civilian.
Yeah. So I would describe it as peer support.
Yeah. Peer support.
It's more peer supportive position versus somebody who has lived experience. Yeah. Go ahead, Brittany.
And tying it back to kind of how we see Peter B. Parker sort of grow into his mastery and power and confidence as a mentor, is that that is what can be powerful about a peer support group dynamic, is that you really, because there can still be clinicians involved, but you more empower the support you more empower the other parts to like really like own mastery of like, you can lead other people. And we do see Peter like come into his own. He's a great leader once he's kind of put in this position of leading these other spider people. And, even at the end of the movie, he says, do I want kids? After he talks about how proud he feels of Miles in their sort of last mission of the movie. And so I think it is that beautiful evolution that can come from doing more like peer support group stuff. Cause also it makes me think of like AA or NA in the sense of like sponsorhood, and that there's people that are engaged in those groups that are different levels of recovery and different levels of their journey. And so they can provide perspective and kind of hope for people who are starting out in that journey. So with what's powerful in the most recent Spider-Man movie, is it Away From Home? Far From Home?
No Way Home.
No Way Home.
No Way Home. Is that younger Peter Parker gets the benefit of two Peter Parkers that are farther along in the road, which made me think of people who do like recovery. And it can be really powerful to see similar people who are making it, who have made it farther than you, and they're doing okay.
Yeah, I agree. I see this in my work with the police all the time. Mm-hmm. The police department has across the police as a population have a really robust peer support component to what they do. And I got to, go through the entire peer support training and to see the models that they do, and the power in it is exactly what you're talking about it. Like, as you're nailing it, like having people that have been through it that offer that support, that ear, that kindness without trying to take on the role of therapist, mm-hmm. but being there to be able to acknowledge and to allow people to feel seen and heard and validated is by their peers that also have felt that same pressure to be perfect, to be the difference makers, to make all the perfect decisions and not be able to. and how to reckon with that is a vital component to dealing with people that have to do things like these heroes do.
Because also too, like sometimes the benefit of peer support also above like a clinician run group is that you don't want to have to explain to the therapist like what's up. And so having more of a peer support group can also, you don't have to like, there can be more buy-in because you don't have to try to explain to a therapist who you think might never get it. And there can be more like a sense of, like universality. Universality is a term that gets used a lot when we learn about group therapy as a clinician. And it just is what it means, which is what is how it sounds, which is just that my experience is shared by others. There is a sharedness in this. It's not just me by myself. And that's usually the most powerful component of group work, is that, like you said in the very beginning of this discussion, Hannah, that I'm not the only one. And I think that was what made me cry about the most recent Spider-Man movie. And it also what feels so sweet into the Spider-Verse is, and how you see them all take from each other too. Like not just even like Miles and Peter B, but like Gwen very much so, like definitely opens herself back up. And the other three Spider people, like Spider Noir and like Penny and Spider Pig and Spider Ham, like they aren't given as much depth, so we can't really speak too much about them because they're used as more like just true side characters and kind of comic relief. But I would imagine it was a healing experience for all of them.
I think so. And I think that is a really unique point of view that we haven't really covered in any of our treatment sections before, that we've had a lot of times where we've had opportunities to cover treatment things with different characters that different members of our audience might listen to, but that we haven't hit this particular aspect of therapy as hard, or the value in it in peer support group, because the modality doesn't exist as firmly outside of intensive treatment, but it's so hard to get people together now that we don't see as much.
We lost you a little bit, Ben. I don't want your point to get lost. But I heard you basically saying it's just a modality that's not utilized because it's just not as available.
It's not there. I come back now. Yeah, sorry. It's not as available. It's not as accessible to people in the community, or not as popular. It's used in intensive treatment situations, IOPs, PHPs, hospitals, and community mental health and substance abuse often. And we see this within the AA model used a lot, but we don't see it in private practice realm where most people seek services hardly ever.
No, group anymore. Is definitely more, it's either intensive settings or community driven, like really within like a recovery community, or like we've talked about like the vet community, it also is. Yeah. I'm sure if I knew more of the history behind it, it's probably also a byproduct of a lack of services and resources. And that's why, some of these things probably have popped up. Well, it's a big old blind spot in insurance as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, and a bigger part of it, I feel like a bigger part of the situation is that it's really hard to figure out how to bill for it. And so if you can't bill for it, insurance wise, it's hard to figure out how to bill for it. And then the alternative is charging everyone. But then by charging everyone, then that's still like, sometimes that could cost more than people have. So it's a really tricky, like in terms of, I know that something that I would really like to try and create is some groups that are available in terms of private practice, because you're absolutely right. It is not something that is available. It's either available in the examples that you were giving, Brittany. So it is pretty hard to access. And the only reason why I was able to access it is because I was in an IOP situation. So it wasn't that I was just able, with all of the privilege that I do have, that I was able to seek out group therapy. It was only in the IOP setting, which is intensive outpatient for people who don't know what that means.
Right. Yeah, it's been available there and it's readily available in court-ordered situations. I know I tried to start 2 or 3 different groups in private practice and eventually gave up because I was trying to run an anger one and put together a program that I thought was really stable. But the people who were coming were not those who had yet been mandated into such a situation, and people weren't consistent. So it's a challenging modality when you don't have the infrastructure around it.
Yeah.
It's very it's very inside baseball. People, unless you're like within this community, you don't realize like how difficult group work is to get off the ground within like the clinical setting, unless you're in an intensive setting. So in terms of Peter B. Parker and Miles as well, is there anything else we haven't covered that we saw in this movie that we want to make sure? I mean, I think just kind of continuing with the Peter B. Parker thing, kind of almost like the healing work is, I think, being able to have the experience of seeing Aunt May again, kind of seeing MJ again. Like it really did give him a lot of opportunities to, I don't know, to like heal parts of himself. I think that it really helped him. I don't know. I really loved it. And I think he did get to experience like a magical situation, which he kind of got to not right wrongs, but sort of like revisit and kind of almost redo sad moments.
Well, it makes me think of when we talked about Endgame, we talked about Thor, about being back in a situation where somebody who knew you from before or knew a version of you and can say to them, you still have value. You still have value. Yes, something happened. Yes, maybe you had some hard choices you had to make that maybe didn't go as well as you thought they would or didn't feel the way that you thought. But that doesn't mean you don't have value anymore. And I think that makes a ton of sense. And I know that all those parts of seeing Peter B. Parker in those situations where when he sees Aunt May and you realize, and I realized in that moment that in their universes, they had both lost each other most recently. And so walking up to the person that you thought was gone and being able to touch them and hug them and that, I mean, it gives me goosebumps right now, even talking about it, like being able to have that experience in real life is so wild. And then also being able to see and how kind of silly and odd he acts when he sees MJ. I think a part of what I really love about this film is that those are very genuine human ways to act. Like it totally makes sense that no matter what they're doing, that him seeing MJ is like, I'm out, guys. Like I'm out. He didn't, it didn't like ruin everything, but like he was out in that like 5-minute version of himself. He was like, this is the most important thing. I know I found my meaning. I know what my meaning is, and I'm standing in front of it. And I have to do something about it. Like, it's just so human. That's such a human response to getting like a quote unquote second chance.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to sort of not slide over treatment, but we kind of hit it on the head a bit. We talked about group therapy. And so that's kind of, our treatment portion of this episode. But before we slide into final thoughts, we're going to take another ad break. Okay, final thoughts. I'll throw it to you, Ben.
Cool. I'll go first. So I absolutely adore this movie. I think it deserved the Oscar that it got. Did it go up against Moana? Was that the one that went out? This one went up toe to toe with, I think 2018, I think, but
2018 is right. Yeah.
Well, whatever it went toe to toe against, whatever Disney movie came out that year, this deserved the win. This is a phenomenal film. It's amazing visually. It's amazing in its storytelling. The voice acting is great. It's just such a revolutionary breath of fresh air to see the blend of the hand-drawn comic styles that honors the original artists who created Miles, and also the advances in technology that make all of these incredible visuals possible. I just love this film. I mean, me and my buddy, who usually go see movies together, sat and watched this and just looked at each other like, holy crap. Like, this was special. This is a special film. And then all of the human components that get tied into it, the way that they tell these stories, the way that the pictures painted, and the authenticness, like you mentioned, like, yes, people get so stuck re-looping these moments of loss and trying to replay them, and to see people confronted with those situations, unable to do anything but let all of that regret and anger flow to a conclusion by talking about it and addressing it with that person, even though it's not their person, but it repairs them in a way that can't be done by so many other things. I loved seeing this, and I loved seeing the overarching themes of self-forgiveness, self-actualization, and realization that in order to solve my problems, I must learn from the people who have been like me and who I idolize, but recognize that I have to be me and do it my way in order to achieve what I need to. And I love that about this movie, and I love it. And I let my daughter watch it for the first time with me today, and she loved it. She was sitting there enthralled and asking so many questions, and even
weeping,
about.
were you just weeping quietly next to her then, like, it's finally happening?
Well, we also watched The Little Mermaid today, and I would much prefer to watch this with her, because after we watched The Little Mermaid, she asked me if we could get married, and I had to explain to her that daddies and daughters can't get married because I'm married to mommy, and for other reasons. But
well, yeah, clearly.
But like just seeing even the way that this movie was so many things that are above a 4-year-old's head, grab her and move her even. Like, I just love this film and look forward to watching it many times.
Mm-hmm. I can go. So I think this is a perfect movie, start to finish. Like, even just watching it again last night, just the way that it sets, like, I've never watched a movie nail the tone so perfectly from start to finish, where it has this almost like gravitas, like scary tones to it sometimes, like thriller energy, while also maintaining like a levity and a wholesomeness. Like, it's amazing how, like, I still get scared, like jump in the scene when he's in his uncle's apartment and he doesn't realize his uncle's the prowler yet. And he comes around the couch and like, there's that big, like, music beat, like sound beat. When that happens, like, I jump every time. Like, this movie, I think, is art. I think it's beautiful looking. I can't get over how stunning it looks visually. That alone, on top of it being like a great story from top to finish, tonally perfect, like we've already exalted a lot, like very emotionally intelligent, diverse, representative, not just like of color, but also like there are 2 female Spider-Mans, female presenting Spider people in this story too. And just, it's such a lovely story. I'm so glad they're making 2 more. I'm so glad it got won an Oscar, and got that respect for that, because animated movies, superhero movies, like action movies, don't really get a lot of credit. And so I'm glad that it did get that. And I'm really excited for the second one, the new ones coming out. I think there's 2 new ones coming out. They're breaking it up into 1 and 2, like part 1 and part 2.
Oh yeah, that's right.
But I love this movie so much. I think that, like you were saying, Ben, like the casting is perfect. Like, whoever decided that Jake Johnson would be sad Spider-Man, that person deserves $1 million bajillion, because tonally he nails it, like beat for beat, so well. And I love this movie. I'll watch it a ton. I saw it multiple times in the theaters because I couldn't get over how good it was and how beautiful it is to see. I want to like live inside the color palette of this movie, and just why aren't all animated movies look like this movie? Like, it's wild how different it feels and unique, and how it feels just like straight up art. So I'll throw it to you, Hannah.
And actually, if you get a chance, look up the movie and look up all the awards that it was nominated for, all the awards that it won. Yes, it won an Oscar, but it won a ton of awards, this film. And I couldn't agree more that it's a perfect film. I love this movie. I watch this movie maybe once every couple of months, because there are so many ways that this movie validates a young person, validates a person who's older, and validates the experience of being a parent. There's so many different ways and different identities that this film is able to give a genuine look at, that makes it feel different from anything else. And it's one of the most beautiful films I have ever seen. And every time I watch it, it blows my mind, the detail in the animation. And every time I think, how did they get it to look like this? Mm-hmm. And what truly magical people who did years of work, if I remember correctly, in order to make this film the just spectacular viewing experience that it really is. And it is just such a beautiful film, and really, And as always, which I feel like I always talk about when the lead character is a person of color, being able to see anyone that looks like you, anyone who you could look like, anyone who you could connect to, or who you have that experience of being surrounded by people who look like you in the community that he has been raised in, is such a beautiful experience, and one that we know makes a huge impact, and one that I hope that I continue to be able to see, because I can't wait to show this movie to my nieces and nephews if they haven't seen it already. It's a movie that I talked to my nieces and nephews about, and did when it first came out, because it's such a magical film. And it makes me very happy. The movie makes me very happy, which is why I watch it so often. So I think
we'll see this movie again.
Oh, I will absolutely see this movie again. I would, if they re-release this movie in the movie theater, I would go fucking see it in the movie theater again. Like it's such a beautiful film. I adore it. It's
never been anything like it. Never.
Emotionally intelligent, emotionally intelligent in a way that just touches my heart. Like, it's just so, and also really captures an experience of being a 14-year-old in terms of all the different things we feel as teenagers. So I love it so much.
No, but Ben, what you were saying is, that's what I was telling Hannah last night. When this movie came out, like the first time animators must have seen this movie, it must have like blown their minds. Like, I don't know how industry people, the first time they saw it. I mean, it blows our minds, but I wonder how revelatory it felt within the industry.
Well, right, this wouldn't have been possible years ago. Like, even like just watching, like I don't know, probably the first Disney movie that came out when I was a little kid would have been The Little Mermaid, I think. And
Beauty and the Beast.
That was 90
on the podcast.
90, I think.
Was
92.
90 something, yeah. 91, I think. But
Little Mermaid's 89.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Little Mermaid was one of the first movies I saw in the theater, if not the first one. And I was like 7, so that makes sense.
But looking at the difference between like that and even some of the modern Disney movies, other than Coco, just what this can do, it was just so incredible.
Well, with that, we'll wrap up our first episode of season 5. Everyone who has found us over the years, people who are maybe finding us now, we appreciate you all being here. I wanted to quickly shout out some fans that engage with us a lot I run our Instagram, but I wanted to say hello to Wildstar Berry, Kay, New Atlas, Molly Brown, Madeline, and Nicolette. I'm assuming you all know who you are. And also, Nicolette, you just bought a t-shirt, some merch from us. Thank you so much for supporting us. We do have merch. If you go to tpublic.com, you can look at Popcorn Psychology. You can find our merch there. You can also support us on Patreon. A lot of this comes straight out of our own pockets. And so we always appreciate any support you'd like to give on patreon.com with Popcorn Psychology. You can find us at Instagram and Facebook at Popcorn Psychology, Twitter at popcorn_psych. We also have a TikTok that is thriving. That's what I'm manifesting. And if you ever want to get in touch with us, you can reach us at popcornpsychology@gmail.com. But we're excited to start in season 5. We have a lot of great movies on deck, and we're excited to share them with you.